Psychiatric diagnosis is at the very bottom of absolutely everything bad that ever happens in the mental health system, and that includes schools, the VA, everywhere. And the reason is, as you know, that if they don't diagnose you, they're not supposed to do anything to you or recommend anything. But once they give you any label, any diagnosis, they can then recommend or do just about anything to you in the name of treatment. And I was once an expert witness in a case in New York in which 3 therapists had done really awful things to this woman, just about destroyed her. And the jury found them not guilty because they said, well, what they were doing was the standard of care. And it's true, but the fact that that's what's usually done doesn't make it right and doesn't make it helpful or healing. So I can't stress strongly enough how important the whole matter of diagnosis is. A lot of people, are increasingly aware of problems with psychiatric medication, problems with physical restraints and isolation, problems with forced commitment and that sort of thing. But too often just don't think about the fact that none of that could have happened if they didn't have the label. So some of the questions that you asked refer to mental illness, as though there are such things. You know, some of you were saying, well, what do you do with people who have mental illness? And so I want to spend a little time on that, unless you've already done all that.
No, please.
Okay.
Please go along.
Okay, so and what I'm about to say is about the most radical stuff you could possibly hear, and I hope it doesn't make you so uncomfortable that you don't want to think about it. But I suggest to people that they stop using terms like mental illness, psychiatric disorder, and why? Well, for the sake of honesty. And the reason is that if we say table, we all know what we're talking about. If I say somebody is mentally ill, we're going to have all kinds of different definitions of what is mental illness as an overarching category, and then each of the many hundreds of categories within the DSM or within the International Classification of Diseases. And so if we want clear communication, which is something that I think is essential when we're trying to work with people who are suffering and we're supposed to be helping them, we need to be crystal clear about what it is we're talking about. And if I say this person's mentally ill and you assume you know what that means, and you assume you know what I mean by that, that's dangerous. That's a setup for miscommunication, problems, and not being able to put the reality of the person who we're trying to help first, and not being able to see their reality. Definitions from, every time there's a new DSM, they themselves have tried to come up with a good definition of mental illness itself, and then they acknowledge publicly, gee, we couldn't. And, if you've looked at the DSM definition of psychiatric disorder or mental illness, you could drive a truck through many of the problems that there are in it. I wrote a book called They Say You're Crazy that I know some of you have seen. There's a whole chapter in there called Whose Normality Is It Anyway? Since normal is supposedly the opposite of mentally ill, I go through a number of different ways we could define normality, different models of normality, and then I talk about what's wrong with each one of them. And so what are we talking about? What is it that when you all were asking questions about mental illness or about specific categories, ADHD, Asperger's, and some of those were mentioned, schizophrenia, what is it we're really talking about? Let's look at the indisputable realities of what we're talking about instead of calling it mental illness. One, we're often talking about suffering, about human suffering. Two, sometimes the person we are trying to work with, they're fine with the way they are, but what they do bothers other people for various reasons. And 3, either or both of the above is the case due to there's going to be A and B. Social factors like poverty, sexism, racism, homophobia, classism, ageism, looksism, and violence. And or B, individual differences in people. Individual differences. Let me spend a couple of minutes on that. So sometimes individual differences, deviations from the norm or what's expected, get diagnosed as mental illness. And I want to mention a book, and I've been trying all day to find the name of it, and I wrote to a friend of mine who's one of the authors. I couldn't hear back from him. Jeffrey Poland, P-O-L-A-N-D, it was the 3rd author on a book. I thought it was called something like Serious Mental Illness or Treating Serious Mental Illness. And of course I object to the mental illness part of it. But let me tell you what they did. They were at the University of Nebraska. They did something really important. They took people who had been diagnosed as schizophrenic. Notice I'm not saying they took schizophrenics. They took people who had been given that label. And that's one thing, by the way, a lot of you were asking, what can we do to make change? One very simple thing you can do is never say anybody is autistic or is schizophrenic or has ADHD. Say at the very least, go one step beyond that and say, they've been given that label. Okay, so Jeff and his colleagues took people given that label of schizophrenia, and of course, people given the same label are very different from each other for a lot of reasons. And what they did was they gave, these were adults, and they gave them every conceivable kind of test. Cognitive tests and projective tests and educational tests, achievement tests, IQ tests, all kinds of things. And in just about every person, they found some kind of what had apparently begun as some kind of relatively small cognitive glitch. And what happens? A baby is born, and the parents expect a baby to be a certain way. And if the baby doesn't do a certain kind of thing that's expected, then the parents are not going to respond as they would if that kid had not acted in that way. In other words, they're going to treat that baby differently than they would treat a baby who didn't do that one thing. So then, of course, the baby becomes a little more different and therefore gets responded to even more differently. So there's a snowballing effect, a difference amplifying effect, and people come to be called weirder and weirder because they're being treated differently by the world than most people are. Now, what Jeff and his colleagues found was when they made the people who had been labeled schizophrenic aware of this, you see the world a little differently, that, when such and such happens, a lot of people feel this way or think this, but that's not how you are. And they weren't saying it was better or worse, and they didn't say you're screwed up because of that. It was quite the opposite. When they made them aware of this, it took away a lot of the problem. And what if they had been able to do that early in their lives? Now, it's not always that simple, but when you look at people's individual differences, instead of saying they're schizophrenic, oh my God, they have hallucinations or delusions, we got to stop that because that's sick. Let's get them on drugs. And then, as many of you know, if you read Robert Whitaker's absolutely essential book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, it's about psychiatric drugs, you see that every psychiatric drug helps some people sometimes, at least for a while, and then sometimes starts hurting those very people that it's helped. But on balance, they harm far more people than they help. So if instead of approaching strange people that way, if we try to understand them and listen to them, and I'll come back to more of what we can do later on, but that's the kind of approach that we should be taking. And I don't know if you're familiar with a new approach called Hearing Voices. If you Google it, the Hearing Voices Network, because everybody always goes, okay, Paula, so let's not call most people mentally ill, but schizophrenics, my God, of course they are, right? What do the Hearing Voices people do? They get together a group of people who all hear voices or have delusions, and then instead of saying, that's sick, we have to stop that in you, they say, talk to us about what do the voices say? Does it sound like anybody familiar to you? How do you feel when you hear the voices? And then talk amongst yourselves about when you hear the voices, if they're scary or upsetting, what do you find helpful in dealing with that? They're having tremendous success, and what a completely different approach that is. And this is an approach that, unlike the drugs, doesn't have what are called side effects. And that's another thing I want to suggest that you do. Never use the term side effects, whether it's for psychiatric drugs or other drugs, because there's nothing side about them when they happen to you. That's a marketing term. These are effects. Every drug affects, say, an antibiotic. An antibiotic, for many people, will kill a certain bacterium, and for some people it won't. Or for many people, they may not have negative effects from taking the drug, but some people will. So these are effects or negative effects that sometimes are common and sometimes are not. But in any case, a Hearing Voices group doesn't have that kind of risk. Now, some of your questions were about what do you do when you see that somebody's been misdiagnosed? And I want to say to you, every psychiatric diagnosis is a misdiagnosis, right? We shouldn't be diagnosing. Now, why is that? Because there is no science behind it. So, in other words, if you say, well, I saw this kid and I think this kid has ADHD, and I say, well, I think this kid actually has oppositional defiant disorder. So how do we figure out which of us is right? It's not like we can run a blood test or do an x-ray and find out which of us is right. In fact, I wrote a play called Call Me Crazy. It's a comedy drama with music, and it has some serious scenes with therapists in it. And you can see it online, actually, if you want. But then it has these skits, these very sophomoric skits, and one of them is called Dueling Therapists. And it's one of the points that's made is, so how do we decide whose diagnosis is right, Dr. X or Dr. Y? And how do we decide? Do we flip a coin? Because there's no science behind it. So how are we going to decide? And why do we want to know what label the person has? Because if there is no science behind the choice of label, then how we try to help that person isn't going to follow from the label we give them. And if we hear, well, if kid has ADHD, you put them on Ritalin. But if there's no such thing as ADHD, if there are kids or people who are distractible for various reasons, then we want to try to find out what helps them, right? But if you act as though the label itself tells you how you're going to be able to help them, that's just a mistake. It's a whopping mistake. And by the way, if people are interested, there's a great guy named David Cohen, who's at UCLA now, who has in detail just taken apart the criteria for ADHD. I mean, he's shown how many of them are just the same thing as each other, said in different words. And what you get back to is they're distractible and somebody's upset about it. Yeah.
So was that a book or just a
Well, I think that part of it is in a book that he co-authored with two other people whose names I can't remember now. One of them is Gomory, Gomory. And I think David Cohen might be the third author. I can't remember.
Paula, if you'll just give breadcrumbs, I'll look up references and put them on the board.
Okay, all right, thank you. And you know, you can send me what you want me to find for you if you want. David Cohen and David Jacobs wrote a paper that doesn't have the word depression in it, but I'll have to look up the reference for you. And it's just brilliant because they say depression is a word that's used all the time, and it's in the DSM, various forms of depression. And they said it is used to indicate so many things that it becomes almost meaningless. You know, some people who say I'm depressed, they're sad, they're lonely, their feelings are hurt, they feel helpless, they feel hopeless, they feel nostalgic, right all the way through to they want to die. Now, all of those people can be diagnosed with major depressive disorder, for example. But calling them all by the same label doesn't make them the same. And it doesn't make what's helpful to them the same. And what Cohen and Jacobs said was, and since the very term itself is used so variably, then when people say, well, and I did a study, we used treatment X, and that was effective in helping people with depression, they were saying it's pretty useless because people with depression are not a unitary, a homogeneous group. Okay. So I'm not even halfway through page 1 yet of page 4 of 4 pages. All right. Do I believe that diagnosis is never good for clients and always harmful? Well, to some extent, I just addressed that because, and again, Jeffrey Poland, in a book I edited called Bias in Psychiatric Diagnosis, I think they charge too much money for it, but maybe the library will order it. He wrote a chapter about the research on so-called schizophrenia. But one of the things he shows the research is just terrible. You know, people say, oh, but schizophrenia, it's been shown to be genetic and it's biologically based. The research is just appalling. If you wanted to create a body of research that's really badly done, that's it. You couldn't do a better job of it. But one of the things he shows is that if you focus on labels, you don't understand who the person is, right? That sounds like common sense. A lot of what I say really is common sense, and so people think, well, what does she know? My grandmother could have told you that, so therefore it must be nonsense. Because don't we need professionals? Don't we need specialized training? Don't we need expert knowledge? And I'm telling you, a lot of this stuff is common sense. So if I'm focusing, if somebody comes to see me and I'm supposed to help them in some way, and if I'm focusing on which DSM category do they fit best, I certainly am not going to ask them about strengths, resources, interests, what do they feel would help. I'm just figuring out which checklist of unscientifically derived symptoms they fit the best. What a thing to do to somebody. So giving somebody a diagnosis, yes, it will interfere. It will cause harm. Another reason it interferes is that these days especially, almost nobody goes to see almost any therapist without getting a psychiatric label. And once you get a label these days, you will almost definitely be told that you should be on medication or in traditional psychotherapy or both. And that is the narrowest set of options I can imagine, but they are the most widely recommended. And if you look at the numbers of people still on medication after many, many years, still in therapy, you know how many years Woody Allen has been in therapy, and look at him, right? This is not what we should be thinking about. When we're considering human suffering and its varieties, and when our job is to try and reduce it, we need to look at everything that helps. So giving a diagnosis narrows our vision, and I'm going to come back to that in a bit too. Also, I mean, you all know, in a lot of settings, you have to assign one of these labels because that's how you're going to get paid for trying to help the person, and I'll come back to that later. So I don't want you to think that I think there's no advantage at all, but does it harm the person ultimately? Yeah, I think it does. Every time I think I've heard every kind of harm that can result, that starts with getting a psychiatric diagnosis, I hear about yet another one. So they range from plummeting self-confidence, because you think something's wrong in you. You may assume it's in your brain. You have a broken brain, chemical imbalance in your brain. There's not a shred of evidence that any of what gets called psychiatric disorders is from a broken brain or chemical imbalance. That's just what pharma wants you to believe. And by the way, big pharmaceutical companies within the last few years have announced they're cutting way back on doing research and development on psychoactive drugs. And the reason they said straight out was that after all these decades, we don't know how they do what they do. We don't know how to predict who's going to be helped and who's going to be harmed. So they're pretty much cutting back on this kind of thing. And when pharma says that, and given the billions of dollars they make from these drugs, that's pretty striking. I have a colleague named Paul Block, who's a psychologist. He's one of the few people, besides Leslie, that I would feel totally comfortable sending somebody to if they wanted to see a therapist. And Paul and I often have the following kind of conversation. He says, but we need psych diagnoses. And I say, no, we don't, and except for insurance, right? And he says, yes, we do. He says, let me give you an example. A teenage girl came to see me the other day, and for 45 minutes I listened to her. And at the end of that time, I said to her, well, you have generalized anxiety disorder. And she said, oh my God, I'm so relieved. Oh, so it is a real thing. And obviously you've seen it before. And so presumably you know what to do about it. He said, see? And I said, Paul, I don't disagree with your having said what you said, except I wish you'd left out one word, and that's disorder, or even leave out generalized. If you had just said, I see you're so anxious. And then there are 3 words that, as a former student of mine, Nikki Gerard, once she coined the phrase terminal words. She said, guilt is a terminal word. There are three things that I think are terminal words, and I'll tell you what I mean by that in a minute. Depression, anxiety, and guilt. And those are terminal words, meaning that when somebody says, that's what I have, or you tell somebody they have that, where do you go with that? There's pretty much no place to go. And because I'm so short on time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but let me just give you the example with regard to anxiety. When people say they're anxious, or when they use any of these 3 words, or when you're thinking about that about yourself, why not suggest that if you weren't going to use that word, how would you describe what you're feeling? Instead of anxiety, you know what they usually say? Fear. Fear. That tells us someplace we can go to figure out what to do about this. What are you afraid of? Let's assess the realities of that. Let's see what we can do to make you feel less afraid, or to decrease what's dangerous about it, if it really is, and that sort of thing. Okay, so for Paul Block to say you have generalized anxiety disorder, if he had just said you're so anxious, or you're scared, I see you're scared, then it's been given a name. It's been spoken about with respect by a professional, and then they have somewhere they can go with that. And she doesn't feel like I'm mentally ill. Okay. Zooming right along. Okay. In researching the biology of mental illness, okay, so somebody said in researching the biology of mental illness like ADHD, pathology and biological basis for mental illness has not been found. Right. I wanted to cheer when I read that. Right. David Oakes, who founded Mind Freedom International, which advocates for psychiatric survivors and tries to help people, not have electroshock when it's been ordered by the court and so on. David Oakes once went on a hunger strike and said very publicly to the American Psychiatric Association, I'm not going to eat until you provide solid scientific evidence that what you call mental illness has a biological or chemical basis. And they finally said, we can't. And I used to blog for Psychology Today. They kicked me off, actually. That's a whole other thing. But one of the essays I wrote was, I read this article, I think it was the New York Times. These two psychiatrists said, well, it is true, yes, it is true that there isn't a shred of evidence that what we call depression is caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, but we're not going to tell our patients that. Now, how stupid of them to admit that publicly, but aren't we glad they did? Because that's what goes on a lot. Psychiatrists will tell you that in medical school, they are not trained to know how to do or assess research, to assess the quality of research. So they rely a lot on what the drug companies tell them, on what their teachers tell them in medical school or psychiatric training. So the person who asked this, who made that statement, the person in your class, went on to say, who are legitimate psychiatric researchers or organizations that have discovered biological causes of mental illness? And the answer is no such thing. No such thing. Now, if you have a brain tumor, of course that could be causing an abrupt, or a really serious change in behavior. But that's not a mental illness. That's a brain tumor. And that's not like these chemical imbalance things. Now, by the way, do you know why it is that psychiatric drugs often harm people? Because I just feel like I should just take a couple of minutes and address that. It's in Robert Whitaker's book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, but you can do people a great service by spreading the word about what I'm going to tell you. Let's say that drugs like Prozac increase the level of serotonin. It's really not that simple, but that's what they're marketed as doing. And the myth is, if you have enough serotonin, you're not depressed, right? That's a myth. It's a myth. But here's what happens. This is the point. Here's what happens. Say you have a level of serotonin in your brain. Say it's here. This is the level. If you start ingesting something with serotonin, or that makes your brain think it's getting more serotonin, your brain says, oh, we're ingesting more, we're getting more. Don't produce as much. It goes down. Now you're ingesting some, so that bumps the level up. And it may raise it even more than where it was before. But here's what happens. Your brain stops producing, your brain kills off some of the receptors in the brain that the serotonin goes into. Is that clear so far? Okay, because we don't need so much. We don't need as much. We're getting more in. So kill off some of those receptors. Well, everybody's brain works differently. So there's no way to predict how much this is going to happen to any individual. And then what can happen for some people is those receptors more and more keep being killed off. So whether these are in regard to serotonin or any of the many other chemicals in the brain, it's changing your brain. And it may overshoot beyond where you or your therapist wanted it to go. And God knows that's likely, since the drug companies admit they don't know how these things work. And there are huge individual variations in how they work. So then to say you decide, well, I don't like the negative effects of this drug, or I felt better for a while, but now I'm not feeling better, or I'm even feeling worse, which also happens. So I'm going to stop taking it. Now, you stop taking it. For some people, they will grow new receptors. People who grow new receptors, some will grow a few, some will grow many, some will grow too many to allow them to function well. There is absolutely no way to predict that either. And that's the mechanism that's operating when we're giving people psychiatric drugs and then when they're going off of them. By the way, do you know that these school shooters, it's not that they're mentally ill, it's that they've been diagnosed as mentally ill and therefore put on psychiatric drugs, and psychiatric drugs have been proven to increase violent behavior. So I'm scared about all these people saying, oh, we've got to get the mentally ill, get guns out of the hands of the mentally ill. People diagnosed as mentally ill only account for about 5%, 3 to 5% of all the violence in this country. But people who have recently gone on a drug or had their dosage increased or decreased, or who've recently come off a drug, are at higher risk for committing acts of violence against themselves and others. And why don't we hear about that all the time in the media instead of get the guns out of the hands of the mentally ill? They're more likely to be victims of violence than people who haven't been diagnosed. But why don't we hear about the high correlation between being on psych drugs and committing these shootings? That's because that's how powerful pharmaceutical companies are. Okay, let me move to the next part. What have I found to be the best treatment for mental illness? Okay, what do you want to say about that, the wording of that question now?
People who are suffering.
Right, right. There are lots of approaches to helping reduce human suffering or helping people understand that they're acting in ways that bother other people, even if they don't bother them, like people with Asperger's or, you know, whatever, or who have hallucinations, or, you know, who are talking about the voices they hear. One of the best psychiatrists I ever knew had a woman come to him, and she told him something that he knew wasn't the case, but she really believed it was going to happen. And she'd been diagnosed as schizophrenic by her previous therapist. And he said to her, he didn't put her on drugs or anything. He said to her, you know, you can talk to me about that as much as you want, but don't tell anybody else. They'll think you're nuts. She did so well in response to that. Okay, so what are better approaches? Well, somebody asked about alternative medicine, holistic approach. One thing I'm going to send you is this. In 2011, I organized a conference at Harvard Kennedy School called A Better Welcome Home. And it was alternative ways of helping veterans and their loved ones. And we had more than 24. And people, each speaker just spoke for, it was either 5 or 10 minutes. And I said, no jargon. And all but about 3 of the people did what I asked, which was just to say, here is my approach to trying to help reduce the suffering of vets and or their families. But you don't have to be a vet. All of these things are helpful for people who are suffering in various ways. And we have all of those videos on a website. And it's everything from service dogs, involvement in the arts, in community action or community service. I have a listening project I do with vets where a non-veteran sits in a room with a veteran from any era, combat or not, woman or man, and really just listens to what they have to say. You don't interview them. You don't ask for definitions of military terms. You certainly don't give advice. You really just listen, but with your whole heart. And we have had enormously positive results of that. Even somebody who said ever since he came back from Vietnam 40 years before, he had been just really desperately wanting to kill himself. And he had one of these listening sessions and he stopped thinking about suicide. So the pathologizing of suicide is a very serious problem. There's a brilliant new book, but nobody I know can afford it. It's by Susan Stephan, S-T-E-F-A-N, and it's about suicide. And I can tell you very briefly what she says, because what applies to suicide applies to trying to help people who are suffering in lots of ways and to different extents. She says, she brilliantly reviews all of the research about the traditional approaches to suicide. Lock them up, medicate them, tell them that, you know, they don't have the right to do this to the people who love them. These traditional things, they don't work. And they often make people worse. And the practice of saying someone's thinking of suicide, that means they're mentally ill, or someone killed themselves, obviously they were mentally ill, is just wrong. And she says, suicide is an expression of intolerable suffering. And so the thing to do, and again, you know, our grandmothers could have told us this. What you do is you say, what would make your life worth living? And let's see if we can make that happen. The professionalizing of care and compassion, the whole field has been overtaken by the drug companies, by the jargon, by diagnosis. And you know, there's this group of people that organized by Bandy Lee, who's a psychiatrist at Yale, saying, Trump is mentally ill. And I wrote a piece for the Huffington Post in which I said, no, he's not mentally ill, he's evil. He's evil. He's exactly like the 12-year-old bully on your playground whom no one ever stopped, whom no one ever said no to. And what does it add to it if we say he's mentally ill? What do we think that tells us more than what he knows? We know he's dangerous because he has done dangerous things. He has assaulted women. He has told people to hurt other people. He has supported racism and sexism and xenophobia and so on. So we need to think about what happens if we stop thinking in terms of mental illness and we think in terms of what really works. So I will send the link to these, you know, more than 24 approaches. And that's not even a comprehensive list, but the point is everyone, and 3 of the people on there got off topic and they were just self-indulgent. So just skip over those when you start seeing them. But you know, there's somebody from the Department of Defense who talks about physical exercise. In the United Kingdom, physical exercise is now the first line of approach recommended for people who say they are depressed or who are diagnosed as depressed. Good. Meditation and mindfulness, that's been shown to work. So look at those. I'd like to add gardening. I'd like to add a whole bunch of other approaches. While I'm on that, use of the arts for helping people, one of the other things I want to urge you to do is not call it art therapy and music therapy and drama therapy. Just call it art and music and drama. Why? Because the arts are enriching for everybody. The arts help people toward joy and delight and creativity and health and optimism. And if I were to say to you, well, person A, you do music. Person B, you do music therapy. Okay, I've just made person B into the other, the sicker, the more deficient. And how do I know that person A isn't going to benefit even more from doing music than person B? So, but you know, there's big money to be made by professionalizing and pathologizing everything. One other thing about these short videos that I mentioned is that, so they're all non-pathologizing. They also are no risk or low risk. I guess if you have a service dog, it might bite you, but you know, nothing compared to the risks of electroshock, which is making a big comeback, and many of the drugs. And by the way, I will not say that no psychiatric drug has ever helped anyone, because some people have told me they have. But this is a good point to say this. And this gets to, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but I wanted, at the end, I'm going to talk about a lot of things that people can do, what you can do differently. There are 2 criteria that absolutely always ought to be met when any professional is recommending anything, and they almost never are. And these are the 2 criteria. Supposing somebody comes in and says to me, I'm suffering, I need some help. So first criterion is, whatever I choose to recommend for this person, I have an obligation to say, this is what I recommend. I recommend X, but I'm going to tell you everything I know and could find out about the potential benefits and the potential risks of X, whether it's a drug, whether it's gardening, whatever it is. But I also have to tell you, if it's a drug I'm recommending, I have to tell you that one lawsuit after another has revealed that the pharmaceutical companies knowingly minimize known effects that are negative effects. So in one lawsuit, it turned out that one of the so-called antidepressants, they knew there had been increased thoughts of suicide in a significant number of people. They called that increases in sadness. And they knew that suicides themselves had increased. They called that increased suicidal thoughts. Okay, so that's one criterion. The second criterion is, if I recommend X, then I have to say to you, but I'm also going to tell you not only why I'm suggesting X for you, but I'm also going to tell you the full range of things that at least some people who are having your kind of experience have found to be helpful. And then you refer them, the Harvard Kennedy School website and anything else that you know of. A sewing circle, having a friend, spirituality, religions for some people. Okay, so those are the 2 criteria, and I think every one of us, yes, school counselors, marriage and family therapists, everybody, and certainly psychologists and psychiatrists, ought to be meeting those 2 criteria, and almost nobody ever does. Now, next question was, somebody said, besides the use of drugs or medication, what do you think is the best treatment for schizophrenia? Well, or for people who are labeled as having. So I've already talked about that a lot. I urge you to read, again, Robert Whitaker's book, Anatomy of an Epidemic. He talks about, I always forget which country it's in. Which country has cantons? Is it Switzerland, I think? Anyway, they're like little, areas, geographical areas. And so somebody took these 2 that were equivalent in population, and they said to the mental health center in one, just keep doing what you always do. And to the other one, they said, try not to use psychotropic medication when somebody comes in and they're hallucinating or they're delusional. And if you do put them on the medication, try to get them off it. That was all they did. So some years later, they looked at what had happened to these people, and the ones who had been put on, more of them had been put on medication, kept on it longer, were functioning vastly worse in the community and in their lives than the ones who had not been put on medication or who'd been put on it just briefly and then carefully tapered off. So that's really important to look at. And one of you wrote, the World Health Organization found that schizophrenia, quotation marks, outcomes were much better in poor countries than in more developed countries like the US. What have we got that they don't have? Big pharma, big diagnosis, right? And lack of community, lack of a sense of community. When people have gone to war and come back, in some cultures, in some Native American cultures, not all, and among the, I think it's the Hmong people, many of whom now live in Minnesota, from Cambodia, what happens is that the whole community knows that going to war is horrible. and they know it's a culture shock. And now coming back home is a culture shock. And I think it's the Hmong people who say, I forget the word they use, but it's kind of like this. It's like, we have your identity here. Just let us help you walk back into it. You know, they understand how different it is, how traumatic it is. And the community considers itself to have responsibility for helping people come back. And the same for somebody who's been raped. And the same for somebody who's been hit by a bus or in a tsunami or who's lost a loved one. Everything is harder if it happens in isolation. Suffering is always worse in isolation. Okay, oh boy, I'm way behind here. Somebody said studies have found that psychiatric medications don't improve long-term outcomes. What are your thoughts? Oh, correct. And I already addressed that. Okay. Dr. Philip Seaman, S-E-E-M-A-N, is somebody I knew when I lived in Toronto, and he's a very traditional conservative researcher. And I think he was surprised by this, and especially his wife is a psychiatrist who treats people diagnosed with psychosis and schizophrenia. Phil Seaman found in this classic study that people put on the so-called antipsychotic drugs. By the way, did you know that they're not called antipsychotics in Europe? They're called neuroleptics, which means it just dampens down your whole central nervous system. So that's a more honest term. Antipsychotic is a marketing term. Let's get rid of that psychosis with this drug. What these drugs do, they're so heavy duty that you may still be hallucinating or having delusions, but you have been so put in something so much closer to a vegetative state that you just don't talk about it. You know, the people you see shuffling around and hardly keep their eyes open and so on. But they're not bothering anybody anymore with their hallucinations or delusions. But what Phil Seaman found was people who had been put on antipsychotic drugs tended to have a lifespan shortened by 20 to 30 years. How many do you think were told that this could happen to them? How many of their parents do you think were told? And their brains literally shrink from the drugs. Now, moving along, somebody said that they weren't sure what exactly I mean when I say there is no science to back up the DSM's diagnosing. Well, I assume that person didn't get a chance to watch the video of my lecture, so you might want to look at it because I give an example in there, and I know a lot of you watched it, so I don't want to repeat it here, but watch the video and take note of what I say about the research as an example on so-called premenstrual dysphoric disorder. It's laughable. If it didn't hurt so many people, you could just think it was funny, but it's appalling. And one of my areas of specialization is research methodology. And I have been horrified to see how poor the research is that the DSM people use to support whatever they want to put in their book. I was on 2 DSM committees for DSM-4 for 2 years, and I resigned on moral and ethical grounds because I said, when there is junk science, badly done science that supports what you folks want to do anyway with the labels, you cite it as though it's well done research and as though the conclusions are beyond dispute. When there's good research, and I said the following in my book, they say you're crazy, and they have never even threatened to sue me because they know it's true. I said, when there's good research and it goes against what you want to do anyway, you ignore, distort, or lie about it. And that's true. And that's why I resigned. So no, there just isn't good research. The other thing is, now that's the most morally repugnant aspect of this. The other side for which I have more compassion is there are people out there who want to do good research about the varieties of human suffering. But the fact is, it is so hard to do good research on human behavior and emotions. And the reason is you can design a study to do in your lab, but that's not a real life situation. So the chances that you'll learn something very meaningful when you're talking about human suffering are very slim. And yet, when you try to do research based in the real world, you know you can't control the factors. And there are so many different factors affecting how somebody acts and how somebody feels that it's just almost impossible to do really good research in that field. Okay. Then somebody said, I love this, the requirements for receiving a DSM diagnosis rely on a person's difficulty in day-to-day functioning. It seems as though this places greater value on social constructs and normative behavior than on the healthy functioning of the individuals involved, and perpetuates negative mental health stigmas. By the way, the people who publish the DSM, you know, when people complain to them about the harm that's done, they say, no, 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 the harm isn't caused by us or by diagnosis. It's the way people out there stigmatize the mentally ill. Well, a guy named Ethan Waters wrote a wonderful article in the New York Times Magazine years ago reviewing the research on anti-stigma campaigns that people have created about various groups. And guess what he found? Anti-stigma campaigns increase stigma. Now, it makes sense once you stop and think about it, because how do anti-stigma campaigns go? See that little crippled child over there? Or see that really crazy person over there? See, they're not like us, right? That's the message. Don't stigmatize them. So it really just bothers me when I hear people say, oh no, the problem isn't with diagnosing or treating people as mentally ill. The problem is the way everybody else stigmatizes them. When, you know, the APA and the DSM people are the greatest stigmatizers of them all. So then the person who was making these comments said, what would you suggest would be a better way to view and or define the spectrum of mental health? So I wanted to ask you, what do you all think?
What was the question again?
What's a better way, other than diagnosis, to view and or define the spectrum of mental health?
Don't define it.
Pardon?
Just don't try to define it.
Yes, exactly. Don't try to define it. Two people who both fit the criteria for bipolar disorder, for example, are going to be so different from each other. So don't treat them like they're the same. Try to get to understand who this person is. Find out everything you can about them. Find out ask them what they find helpful. Almost nobody does that. You know what a lot of therapists do? If you recommend something and then the person comes back and says, well, I tried it and it made me feel worse, you're resisting, you know, or you didn't do it right, right? You tell me, what do you find helpful? Now, there will be some people who say, I don't know, I'm just so bereft, I don't even know anymore what would help. And then, you know, again, then you go to these alternative approaches and instead of defining a spectrum of mental health, because, you know, I know somebody who was diagnosed as schizophrenic, and he is one of the most creative people I've ever met. And no, it's not because he has hallucinations. It's the medication he's on that's keeping up the hallucinations, frankly. Oh, and by the way, every psychiatric drug can do the opposite of what it's marketed as doing. So the so-called antidepressants have been shown to increase depression in people. That's why they cause suicide. The so-called anti-anxiety drugs can cause anxiety, and the so-called antipsychotics can cause hallucinations and delusions. And again, that's because of this kind of feedback loop that I talked about in the brain and the receptors and so on, that we don't have any control over how our brains are going to respond to these drugs. And so do they do things to the brain? Yes. And by the way, the drug companies, if they want to market a new antipsychotic drug, what they will study for about 6 weeks, you can believe, I mean, appallingly short times, is does this stop their hallucinations or delusions? But they won't look at almost any other effects that the drug has, unless they see another good effect, and then they can get a patent on that, you know, and make a lot more money. But anyway, but I want to suggest something very simple too, which is that instead of using diagnostic terms, how do we think about the varieties of mental health or human suffering? We go back to the words that the poets and the novelists use. They tend to use much richer language, more varied language, more specific language that helps you pinpoint what is this person experiencing. I made a documentary called Is Anybody Listening? That's about the gulf between veterans and non-veterans in our country. And we found, it was based on my listening sessions that we do with veterans, and we found that when they know that a non-therapist is going to listen to them, they're not afraid of being pathologized. They often feel much freer to speak than they do to a therapist. And there are 2 sentences that people say in these listening sessions, the listener says. They say one to start the session, and I want to tell you what it is. And then there's a second one that they may say, and I'll get to that. The non-therapist says to the veteran, as an American, I take some responsibility for what you experienced in the military and trying to come home. And if you want to talk, I will listen for as long as you wish to speak, and I will not judge. And then you really do just listen, but you listen with 100% of your attention and your whole heart. And it's amazing. Vets have used the term magic. Nobody's ever given them a chance to do this before. Nobody's going to ask them to define terms. Nobody's going to say, well, you shouldn't feel guilty that your buddy died because it wouldn't have done any good if you had died too, and it wasn't your fault. You know, they don't want that kind of, who wants that kind of advice when you're grieving, when you're devastated? And the second kind of thing that people are allowed to say in the listening session, we tell them, you only speak the second sentence if it's been at least half an hour, 45 minutes or so, and the veteran has told you some awful experience they had and how it's affecting them now. And the reason you say this second sentence is because so many vets pathologize themselves, or other people have pathologized them. Not you have war trauma, of course you feel this way, look what you've been through. Not because you were raped by your sergeant, of course you're upset, but you have PTSD and that's a mental illness. And I know a lot of vets have been told, and you'll never get over it. Well, you will never be the same. But to say you'll never get over it, over having a mental illness, when what people are having is a deeply human reaction, what a vicious thing to do to people who are already suffering. So the second sentence that we say the listener can say is, oh, and by the way, and a lot of vets, even if they haven't been told they're mentally ill, think they are, because they'll say to themselves, I'm home and I'm safe now. Why do I still have to sit facing the door and with my back against the wall? What's wrong with me? Well, what could be more understandable? You know, so that second sentence goes like this. You say, and by the way, veterans do not like to be told that non-veterans understand them. Because they'll say, how can you? You haven't been through it. So don't even say that. It's you know, it's like a red flag. But what we do say is, if I had experienced what you described experiencing, I'm sure that, like you, I would be having whatever it is, nightmares, flashbacks, insomnia, whatever it is. And I hope you know that's a deeply human reaction. It's not a mental illness. It is remarkable, whether I worked with vets or with people suffering in other ways, how many times I have found myself saying to them, of course you feel that way. Why would you not? If your best friend or your parent or your child went through what you just described, would you think they were screwed up because it upset them? People are told in so many ways that they're crazy, that they need to hear these very simple, respectful statements. It is so healing. Now, this made me almost cry. Is the DSM likely to become more regulated? Oh my God, no. Do you all know about the ethics complaints we filed with the APA? Okay, you saw that in the video of my lecture. All right. So they dismissed these complaints. Each complaint was 60 pages long. And they dismissed them without paying any attention to what the complaints were about, to what had happened to these people, and that it so clearly started with being given a DSM diagnosis. And they gave two so-called reasons for dismissing the complaints. Both of them held no water whatsoever. They were just obviously false. And so one of the complainants, who lives near APA headquarters, and I was visiting the area at the time, we decided to go to APA headquarters and go in and ask to meet with the head of the APA ethics committee, because we had written ahead and tried to get an appointment, because I wanted her to have to look at one of these people and see her as a human being. And then say, and your ethics committee did nothing. So, and by the way, the APA made $100 million from the previous version of the DSM, the previous edition, and they didn't spend a cent to redress any of the harm they had caused. And even the drug companies are required, you're supposed to keep records. If somebody calls in and says this anti-allergy pill made me nauseous, they're supposed to keep records of these things and report them and make them public. The APA is not required to do that with the effects of diagnosis, and they're not required to redress the harm. And then we filed complaints with the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Health and Human Services, and they too dismissed them. And I think they did it because they thought, oh my God, there's going to be a torrent of these complaints if we say that these have merit. I have tried for decades to get congressional hearings. The APA, by the way, is legally a lobby group. So lobby groups, by definition, what are they about? Their purpose is to get more money, power, and territory for their members. So why would they want to be regulated? And nobody is making any attempt to regulate them. I think that there are only two things that could help. One, I wrote about when I wrote They Say You're Crazy in 95, I think it was, a lawsuit. I cannot find any lawyer except a Scientologist, God help us, and I won't go near them, they're dangerous, who will take on one of these cases. And the other thing that I think could make a big change is a film with like George Clooney or somebody, to reveal the kind of things that I'm talking to you about, because most people don't know. And I have some other solutions I'll get to. Then somebody asked me, Alan Francis said he thought there's going to be a big epidemic of adult ADHD diagnoses. They wanted to know, has that happened? And I don't pay any attention to what he says. He was the head of DSM-4. He talks out of both sides of his mouth. So I don't know if the frequencies have increased, but so many diagnoses are increasingly used, and there are more diagnoses all the time. So then somebody asked me, about what I had written, a comment I wrote after somebody's article in, I think it was Women's E-News or Women's Media Center. I was saying there's no such thing as ADHD. So this person said, so what's really going on in the minds of people who are distractible and whose minds race much faster? And what are alternative treatments to medication? Well, and what do you say to parents who find their kids function better when the kid's medicated? Well, I would say that many people of any age who are distractible, there are a lot of different reasons for it, and they all need to be explored. One kind of thing is that they are anxious or scared about something. Another is that there may be problems in the family, and that makes it hard for them to concentrate. Another kind of thing is that some people, there's a spectrum. I co-authored a book with my ex-husband about this called Children's Learning and Attention Problems. This was in 1974, I think. And ADHD wasn't even a term being used then. But distractibility was being called minimal brain damage back then, like that's any better. But we said in our book that every person has an attentional style on a continuum, and at one end are the very distractible, and at the other end are the over-focuser. And if you give anyone, stimulant medication like Ritalin, it moves them in the over-focuser direction. So will it increase the ability of people who are very distractible to focus? Yeah, it will. What if it's given instead to somebody who's in the middle of the spectrum? It makes them into an over-focuser. If you give it to an over-focuser, it can make them extremely agitated. Over-focusers tend to experience everything more intensely, and distractible people less intensely, for obvious reasons. The more of your attention that goes to anything that's happening, the more intensely you will experience it. So some people will talk about, well, I'm sorry, I don't want to get too much into detail about this, but the point is that there are lots of things that can cause distractibility, and so most people who are very distractible will become less distractible as they grow older. And so partly you want to do things like, obvious things, reduce the distractions around them when they're trying to do their homework or trying to concentrate. Talk to them about the fact that it is harder for them to pay attention than for other kids too. Some people want to put those very distractible kids on medication so they can do better in school, but there are real problems with the effects of that medication. There's some evidence that it prevents them from growing physically. Robert Whitaker has found some evidence that people who are put on these stimulant drugs when they're young, and they get diagnosed with ADHD, put on stimulant drugs, that they then later get diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And I'm not sure why. I think there are two possibilities at least. One is that when the drug is taking effect, you're in one kind of state, and when it wears off, you're in another kind of state. And so some therapists, when they see changes of state, they will say, oh, bipolar. But the other is, and this is what Bob Whitaker thinks is in fact happening, is that the effect of the stimulant drugs on these developing brains is such that it causes serious mood problems. So the other thing is, and this is so largely unexplored, and I know a lot of you are interested in school counseling, the chemicals they use to clean school buildings are often so awful for anybody's brains. I know teachers who've had to give up their careers, and it turned out it was because of the effect of these chemicals on their brains. They would get fibromyalgia, they would have chronic fatigue, they would have brain fog, and certainly it affects some kids that way. So that needs to be explored. Food allergies can do it. Can cause sleepiness, can cause agitation, can cause distractibility. So all of those things need to be explored. Now, let's see. Where am I? Page 3. Okay. Unfortunately, how is the work with veterans progressing, and have lawyers responded to your request to help remove diagnosis from the records of veterans? And what additional harm is done to veterans through diagnosis compared to the rest of the population? Okay, so we're not doing too badly on time. Oh my God, I can't believe it. Okay, so about the veterans. For veterans, a lot of this, everything I've said applies to veterans too. The differences include the following, and this is not going to be an exhaustive list. 93% of Americans have never served in the military, and about 99% have never been in combat. The world of the military is totally different than the civilian world. And even someone who loved their civilian life, went into the military, loved that, did well, and then came home, has gone through 2 major culture shocks. And how are we to know that unless we listen to them? So many veterans won't talk to us about their experiences. So here they are, whatever your politics, they're serving in our name. It's our money. And yet 93% of the population doesn't have a clue what their experiences have been. Veterans know this. They don't want to talk to us most of the time, because they think we won't understand. They think we will think they're crazy for reasons that I've explained. Sometimes they think they're crazy. And that's one reason I started the Listening Project. But one of the really terrible things that happens is that because the VA system is so bad, and there are some wonderful people at some of the VA facilities, some really wonderful people, but the system is such a mess. And when Veterans for Common Sense and another veterans group brought a lawsuit against the VA's mental health system, and a circuit court or a federal court, I can't remember now, it was a few years ago, they ruled that the mental health system was a mess, that there were egregious delays, that the money was disappearing like crazy and nobody had any record of what it was being used for. Everybody knows that the drugs are doing a lot of harm. And because of that, it's really easy just to keep putting vets who are suffering on more and more drugs. You know, if you only see a vet, if you're a psychiatrist and you only have time to see a vet once every 6 weeks or 8 weeks for 10 minutes, so you regulate their meds. Now, what I'm about to say may shock you, and I swear it is not at all an exaggeration. It is not unusual to meet a vet who is on 6 or even 12 psychotropic drugs at the same time. There was someone actually who was in MSU. He was one of the first vets I ever listened to. And he kept falling asleep. He was a lovely man. He was so gracious and polite, and he kept falling asleep. And he finally said to me, I knew he had been horribly attacked in Iraq and injured in almost every organ of his body. And finally said to me, I'm so sorry, I feel terrible, I keep falling asleep. He said, I haven't eaten in 5 days and I haven't slept in 5 days. And I said, do you know why? And he said, because my doctor put me on Dexedrine. You know, it's a stimulant, it's a very strong stimulant. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, you know, when I was attacked in Iraq, he said I was knocked out. And so he thought it might have, you know, I might have had a concussion. And I said, but why did he give you Dexedrine? And he said, well, let's see. It might do something to your brain. As vague as that. Might do something. So this poor guy, because Dexedrine tends to keep you awake and tends to get rid of your appetite, hadn't eaten or slept for 5 days. He also told me he was on an antidepressant. And I said, oh, were you depressed? And I'm thinking, given what he's been through, it's not surprising if he's feeling down, if he's feeling demoralized, if he's feeling helpless, hopeless. And he said, no. He said, I have a lot of pain in my back. And so, well, then why did he give you an antidepressant? He said, I don't know. Now, drug companies' research on their own drugs is appalling. If you designed a study for a course at MSU that was as badly designed and irresponsibly interpreted as most of the research drug companies do on their own drugs, you would flunk the course. And even less does anybody ever study interactions between 2 drugs or among 3 drugs. So vets are guinea pigs on a huge scale. And it's not just vets. I had an undergraduate student years ago who, she was shaking. She was at my house. We were working on a paper, and she was shaking. I said, oh, I can turn up the heat. She said, no, it's not that I'm cold. And I said, well, you're shaking. She said, well, I was worried that I was overweight, and so I wasn't eating much. And now I'm on 3 psychiatric drugs. And she said, the shaking is a drug effect. My psychiatrist told me that. And I said, oh, well, are they taking you off that drug? She said, well, the problem is she doesn't know which one it is that's doing it, or if it's a combination of 2 of them or of all 3. So she just doesn't know where to begin. And this is happening all over the country. Have lawyers responded to my request to help remove diagnosis in the records of veterans? So here's what happens. If you are traumatized by a war experience, or because you've been sexually assaulted, and of course you're upset, well, you may go see a military therapist. And then, of course, you get diagnosed as mentally ill. And many, many service members are being discharged on the basis of that mental illness diagnosis. Now, every branch of the military has a Board for Correction of Military Records, and you can appeal that to them. And I've written an article that I can send you the link to if you want, about someone I helped submit such an application. And I said, this person was raped twice and was devastated and had never had any emotional or behavioral problems before, but this just wrecked this person. And of course it did, and they never should have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which is a big one for women who are upset. Borderline personality disorder, oh, she's difficult. And then this person was discharged because they had borderline personality disorder. And so what I've wanted to do is to get a series of cases like this where I will read the records, I will write an opinion saying this person should never have been diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder, and therefore they should not have been discharged on the basis of being mentally ill, and the record should be changed. And if we have 6 or 8 of these, and I just got the name of somebody today who might be one, but let me, have people get in touch with me to hear about them. If we can get a series of these appeals put in, then if all of them get rejected, that's a big media story. We need people to know that that's what's going on. And if any one of them gets approved, then that's good news. That's a precedent. But we need to get the word out, because these boards are not accountable to anybody, and they make their own rules, and they don't tell you on what their decisions were based. So they get away with murder. There's an investigative journalist, Aaron Glantz, who wrote a lot about that. So I I have a lawyer or two who are willing to try to help with these cases.
Paula, what's that article you were just referencing? I was trying to find it.
Aaron Glantz,
Borderline.
GLD.
Borderline personality, the article that you wrote on borderline.
Oh, that I wrote about borderline?
Yeah.
It was in the journal called Aporia, Aporia, and it was, if you do Aporia and my name.
Yep.
Aporia, a nursing journal. It was published in Canada in a nursing journal, right? Because it was too radical for.
What was the name of the article? Do you remember?
I don't remember, but
okay.
Write to me and I'll look it up. Okay. Now we've just got a few minutes left. I've got a list of 10 things about what can we do. So I'll go through them very quickly. And by the way, if we don't have time for you to ask other questions, you can email me anytime. Okay. 1, never reify any single category or the whole overarching categories of mental illness or psychiatric disorder. Do you know what I mean by don't reify it? Like, don't ever say somebody has Asperger's, say they've been given the label, right? And try to avoid using the labels if you can. But when somebody says, oh, I have a friend who's bipolar, say, well, you know, there's no such thing. And I know that surprises you, but there is no such thing. This is fake science, you know? That's not like what Trump calls fake news. This is really fake science. Right? So help educate people that way. Secondly, I have been dying to do the following thing, and maybe you all have some idea about where we can get funding, or you'd want to work with me on this. It wouldn't take much time. When I had gone to see my OBGYN, in the waiting room, there are these brochures. Should you be on hormone replacement therapy? The answer is no, God, no, don't do that. But, right, they're produced by the drug companies that make the hormone drugs, right? But I thought, oh, in the waiting room of every therapist and every MD, there should be a brochure. What you should know about psychiatric diagnoses. And it would be the 3 myths about psychiatric labels. 1, that they're scientific. 2, that they help you reduce suffering. And 3, that they don't carry any risks of harm. And then we would cite references, you know, for people who want to read more. And what should you do instead? The kinds of things we've been talking about here. Just a full color brochure. I think I need about $3,000 to produce it. And then we put it on the internet and have anybody who's going to see a therapist should take this in, should know this. Because I know so many people who, you know, they were upset. They were told, you're bipolar. You need to be on this medication. We need to hospitalize you for 6 weeks, da-da-da-da-da. They didn't know what questions to ask. They didn't know to say, well, there's no such thing as bipolar disorder. So what's really happening? And how are you going to justify? How do you explain what you're suggesting that I do? Third, somebody said, should there be informed consent about psychiatric diagnosis and medication? Absolutely, yes. So I've already addressed this when I talked about the 2 criteria that should be met, but that never are. What to tell anyone you diagnose? Okay, so some of you, or maybe all of you, will end up being in places where they require you to assign a label, because that's how your salary's going to, you're going to get reimbursed. And so I suggest the following things. Tell them that you are labeling them and why. It's all about the money. Tell them what you're labeling them with, which label you're giving them and why. Tell them that even when you give them the most innocuous sounding labels, you know, everybody goes, oh, I just diagnose everybody with adjustment disorder. I can tell you about a lawsuit about somebody who was deemed to be mentally ill because she was given that label. She was denied health insurance because, anyway, on and on and on. So tell them what label you're giving them and why. Tell them what they should believe and know instead. They should know there's no science behind this label. They should know what you think really may be going on with them, or that it's going to take more time for you to figure out if you're going to be able to help them and how. And tell them and show them what you're going to write on their chart. In the book, Bias in Psychiatric Diagnosis, which I edited, in the introductory chapter, I say the following thing. Wherever it is that you have to write their diagnosis, write in huge letters, the fact that this person has been given this label should not be interpreted as revealing anything about their ability to be a good parent, a good student, or a good worker. And if anyone seeing this label has any questions about this person, here is how you can contact me. And then make a photocopy of that page and give it to the patient or client. Tell them they don't have an abnormal brain. They don't have weird brain chemistry. Tell them, as we tell veterans, this is a deeply human reaction. And to know in their hearts what you've just said is true. There was a woman veteran, another woman veteran I knew, who had been raped in the military and was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Well, she wanted to get benefits from the VA. She was really having a hard time. She was still understandably very shaky, and she had 2 young kids at home, and she just couldn't have a paid job at the same time. It was just too much. And so she wanted the benefits from the VA, but they said, well, you have to have a label. So she was trying to get it changed to PTSD, because that sounds so much less awful than borderline personality disorder. And she said to me, I know how you feel about PTSD. And I said, well, that's because it could be used to harm you. But I said, but since I can't change the system for you and you deserve to have these benefits, you fight to get the label changed to PTSD, but know in your heart, you're not crazy. You're not psychiatrically disordered. Know that in your heart. And that can be very, very helpful to people. As for accepting these labels in order to get services, which also veterans and lots of other people do, kids in school, what do they say? Parents, you get your kid diagnosed and then we'll give them special help. Not until you get them diagnosed, and often medicated if that's the recommendation. So you got a gun held to your head. And since we can't change the systems yet, sometimes we have to work around it the best way that we can. The thing to keep in mind is whether you're a veteran or whether it's a kid in school, are the services that the diagnosis is going to get you, are they really going to be helpful? Because, at the VA, they'll get you on the 6 drugs or the 12 drugs and then you kill yourself. Or you can't be a good parent because you're so drugged. And at the school, what is going to be the outcome? A woman in a Starbucks, her little boy, she was working there, and her little boy started talking to me, and I said to her later, your little boy is so adorable, and he's so gracious, and he was so interesting to talk to. And she was a single mother, and she looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. She said, the school has him on stimulant medication, and they give him blood tests to make sure I make him take his drugs, and they won't give him special help if I don't make sure that he does that. Now, that's where the system needs to be changed, but at least you can tell parents in that situation that you don't like it. Now, you may get fired for saying that, but somebody needs to speak the truth to them, and somebody needs to change the systems. If you're in a position to fight this kind of thing publicly and within your school system, please do it, or get other people to do it if they're people whose jobs won't be in jeopardy. Somebody asked, what can we do as students and training professionals to change the narrative from what someone has as a label to what they are enduring, their suffering, etc. That's wonderful. Do you all know about the ACE work, ACE? Oh, okay. So Vincent Felitti. So, you know, the whole notion of, instead of saying what's wrong with you, saying what happened to you is transformative. And I think we can't emphasize that enough. So fifth recommendation, don't spend time worrying about what's in the DSM and whether it's a problem that Asperger's is not in there anymore and now you have just the autism spectrum disorder, because these are all officially psych labels. So as I've said again, focus on the specific individual, their difficulties, their strengths, the resources around them, and look at the Kennedy School website and elsewhere for these non-pathologizing approaches. And as I said before, see if they feel better with what you try with them and ask them what they want and really listen to them. 4 more quick suggestions. Do you have the psych diagnosis website that I created and haven't had time to add to in a long time? Okay, it's psych diagnosis, SYCH diagnosis is all one word, .weebly, WEEBLY.com. On that website, there are several solutions, proposed solutions to the problem of diagnosis. There are short videos of some of the people who filed the complaints that I referred to earlier, and these are less than 10-minute videos. Watch them, they're so compelling. Some of them we had to get actors to do because the person couldn't jeopardize themselves by doing it themselves. But they're very compelling. There's a lot of good information on there. But one of the solutions on that website that I want to mention is what I call the radical solution of honesty. For a long time, and admittedly, it's really hard to think of getting insurance companies to agree to this. But when people say, "But if you don't use diagnosis, how do we get reimbursed?" Well, here's the deal. If you talk to people at the insurance companies, and if you talk to therapists, everybody knows that here's what's going on. A therapist has somebody coming in, they're suffering, and they think, oh, so if I have to give them a DSM diagnosis, the closest one would be adjustment disorder. But this insurance company will only pay for 4 sessions. And I think it's going to take us longer than 4 sessions. So I'm going to say she has major depressive disorder, because that way we can get 25 sessions. Everybody knows this is what's happening. We're jumping through hoops, all right? So my radical solution of honesty is that should be the procedure. Anyone who is licensed to assign psychiatric labels should be told the following. Instead of giving a label, just describe the problem. There was a center in Providence, Rhode Island that required this on every chart. Just what is the person's problem, like in ordinary words, why are they coming to you? What needs to be changed? What needs to be better? And then each time you saw them, you had to check in with them about, is it better? And if not, so what are we going to do about it? What are we going to change? And then if at the end, and then you would say to the insurance company, I think I'll need 20 sessions with this person. And at the end of the 20 sessions time, if they're not all fine, then instead of saying, oh, I thought they had major depressive disorder, actually they have bipolar disorder, so I need even more. Instead of that, you say, here's what we've tried, and this didn't work, so we're good. I'd like X number of more sessions, and so here's what we're going to try. In other words, just being honest. Now, what are the chances of that happening anytime in the near future? Not, but that would make total sense, and it would probably result in better work on the part of therapists. Really quickly, okay, number 7, join an organization called NARPA and attend its conferences. It's the only organization whose conferences I absolutely love. It stands for National Association for Rights Protection and Advocacy. They're meeting in Baltimore in late September of this year. These are the people, it includes people who've been harmed in the psychiatric system. Some of them are now activists. Some of them do peer counseling. By the way, peer counseling is another wonderful approach. People who've been through difficult times and counsel each other. The problem comes up when that gets co-opted, you know, and you're told, oh, we know you're a peer counselor, but make sure you get them on their meds, or make sure you get them to agree to inpatient treatment if, you know, or electroshock or whatever it is. But anyway, but NARPA includes lawyers who advocate for people who have been in the mental health system and had problems with the system, and who advocate for them. And Robert Whitaker has spoken there. Jim Gottstein, who's a lawyer who's a great advocate for people in the mental health system. And at NARPA, and even online, they have a, you know, I don't know the difference between a list and a chat room and all of that stuff, but they have something like that. And you can learn about various kinds of groups, who's doing what and where. Create your own groups, or join with other people, or model your own group on existing ones. Number 8, form your own lobby groups as part of your professional organizations or guilds, or separately educate members of Congress, school boards, parents, patients, and so on. 9, with regard to much of the above, see that website I mentioned, the psychdiagnosis.weebly. And finally, I want to make a documentary about this. Nobody has, but there are a lot of people, I think, who need to have this information, and I'd love to make the film. Let me say one other thing, because I'm also, you know, I'm also an ardent feminist, and when I taught at the University of Toronto, graduate students would often ask me, they'd say, well, I want to write this dissertation that's really radical, but I'm afraid that my committee won't let me get through if I do, you know, and they were feeling guilty about not being activist enough yet. And my answer is always, everybody has to decide for themselves when they can take a risk and how much of a risk they can take. So all of those suggestions that I gave you, I don't want anybody to feel like, oh my God, I couldn't possibly do all that, or I need a job, you know? And so that's why I tried to give you a range of things, everything from just, you know, even if you just say people labeled as, you know, as having this, or if you just say, if somebody says this person is bipolar, if you say, oh, you mean they've been given that label? I wonder how that happened, because I've heard that those labels are not scientific at all. So I wonder how people get those, just to make people stop and think, because one of the things I want to have in my film that I'm going to make, right, is about all these celebrities who announce that they are bipolar. You know, and just one example that just broke my heart, Catherine Zeta-Jones announced that she was bipolar. And bless their hearts, you know, they think they're doing a service to all those other people out there who have bipolar disorder and are ashamed of it. You know, so they think they're doing a service. And so I thought, well, what do we know? I mean, I don't know Catherine Zeta-Jones personally, but what do I know about her just from what's been in public knowledge? In the year when she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, her husband, Michael Douglas, was diagnosed with throat cancer, looked like he was dying, must have been terrifying, and then said something really embarrassing about how he got it on a talk show. I mean, he didn't get it on a talk show. He said on a talk show how he had thought he had gotten it. I thought, oh, she must have been mortified. She must have been terrified he was going to die. And one of her stepsons, through Michael Douglas, was thrown in prison for drug dealing. And I thought, okay, so how would any of us deal with all of that? We would be scared. We would be sad, we would feel helpless, but she's an actor, and the show's got to go on. So there she must have been alternating between despair and fear and all of this stuff, and having to buck up and go put on a show. Now there's the bipolar, right? She had changes in mood. And somebody told her that was bipolar disorder. I think that's just tragic.
Mm. Mm. Thank you for always making it so human, bringing the humanizing element back. So very much appreciated.
Look who's talking. Thank you.